The morning sun painted New Earth's crystalline spires in shades of amber and rose as Clint Bennett strode through the floating corridors of Sapien's Intergalactic Academy. His footsteps echoed against the transparent alloy floors, joining the symphony of alien languages that filled the halls. After 5 years of teaching here, he still marveled at how Earth had transformed from a backwater planet to the galaxy's premier educational hub in less than a century. He paused at his classroom's threshold, taking in the familiar sight of his diverse student body. Three-armed Centaurians shared desk space with crystalline Proxima natives, while a group of gaseous nebulans floated in their containment spheres near the ceiling. But today, something was different, something that made his breath catch. In the front row sat an Alvarian. Her skin was the deep blue of Earth's oceans, marked with bioluminescent patterns that shifted like starlight on water. Silver hair cascaded down her back in intricate braids that seemed to move of their own accord. But it was her eyes that held him, solid white, yet somehow managing to convey an intensity that made him feel like a specimen under a microscope. "Professor Bennett," she stated, her voice carrying the characteristic metallic resonance of her species. "You are 3.4 seconds late." Clint checked his chronometer. "Actually, I'm 2 minutes early." "By your primitive timekeeping standards, perhaps." She tilted her head. "I am Elira Koren, transfer student from the Alvarian Science Institute. I have studied your species' educational methods and find them." She paused, searching for the right word. "Quaint." A few students snickered. Clint crossed to his desk, refusing to be baited. "Well, Ms. Koren, our quaint methods have produced some of the galaxy's finest minds. Today's lesson—" "Yes, I've reviewed your curriculum," Elira interrupted, pulling up a holographic display. "You intend to discuss Earth's first contact period. However, your materials contain numerous emotional anecdotes that detract from the factual analysis." "Those emotional anecdotes are what we call historical context," Clint replied, keeping his voice level. "Understanding how people felt during—" "Feelings," Elira cut in again, her bioluminescent patterns flashing with what he interpreted as disdain, "are irrelevant to historical analysis. The Alvarian method focuses purely on causality and quantifiable data." "Really?" Clint leaned against his desk, crossing his arms. "Then explain why the Proximan Unity chose Earth as their first contact point instead of technologically superior worlds." "Simple. Proximity and resources." "Wrong," Clint smiled. "They chose us because we made them laugh." The class fell silent. Elira's patterns shifted to a deeper blue. "Explain." "Our first transmission to their ships wasn't a mathematical sequence or scientific formula. It was an episode of I Love Lucy. They found it so entertaining that they decided humans were worth meeting. That is—" Elira's fingers twitched as she added to her notes, "highly illogical. Welcome to humanity." Clint turned to the class. "Now, who can tell me about the great misunderstanding of 2089? As other students raised hands, or tentacles, or light appendages, he noticed Elira's growing agitation. Her patterns had shifted to rapid pulses of indigo and violet. Colors he'd learned indicated intense focus in Alvarians. The lesson proceeded, with Elira interrupting every few minutes to correct what she saw as emotional contamination of historical facts. By the time he reached the handshake incident, where Earth's first diplomatic gesture was misinterpreted as a threat by the Centaurians, his patience was wearing thin. "Ms. Koren," he finally said, "if you find our teaching methods so inferior, why did you choose to study here?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. Her patterns froze momentarily before resuming their rhythmic flow. For the first time, she seemed uncertain. "The Science Institute believed direct observation of human irrationality would be instructive." "So we're a research project?" "Precisely." Her confidence returned. "Your species' insistence on filtering everything through an emotional lens is fascinating, if ultimately self-limiting. For instance, your current physiological responses indicate frustration, yet you attempt to mask it with humor. Highly inefficient." Clint opened his mouth to respond when his foot caught the edge of his desk. Pain shot through his toe as the heavy metal corner connected with bone. "Son of a—" He bit back the curse. eyes watering reflexively. Illyra leapt from her seat, patterns blazing brilliant white. "Professor, you're malfunctioning!" "What?" He blinked back, tears, confused. "Your optical units are leaking." She moved closer, studying his face with scientific intensity. "Is this a common hardware failure in humans? Should I alert medical services?" The class erupted in laughter, but Illyra remained deadly serious, her patterns now pulsing with what he recognized as alarm frequencies. She reached toward his face with long, elegant fingers before catching herself and pulling back. "It's just tears," Clint explained, fighting back a smile. "Humans produce them when we experience strong emotions or physical sensations. It's perfectly normal. You deliberately secrete fluids from your visual organs?" Her tone suggested she found this both fascinating and mildly repulsive. "For what purpose?" "It's not deliberate, it's automatic, and they serve multiple purposes: lubricating our eyes, expressing emotions through liquid emission." She was already taking notes, her holographic display filling with complex formulae and diagrams. "Is this process controllable? What triggers it? Are there different chemical compositions for different emotional states?" "Look, maybe we should focus on the lesson. This is the lesson." Illyra's patterns had shifted to the rapid strobing he associated with intense scientific curiosity. The physiological manifestation of emotional states in humans could provide valuable insight into your species' decision-making processes. "Professor, I must study this phenomenon." "I'm not a lab rat, Ms. Koren." "No, you are a human educator with a fascinating biological response system." She straightened, assuming what he'd come to think of as the Alvarian formal request posture. "I hereby submit an official petition to conduct a scientific study of human lacrimal responses, with you as the primary test subject." More laughter from the class. Clint pinched the bridge of his nose, feeling a headache coming on. "Ms. Koren, I don't think—" "I have already submitted the necessary documentation to the Academy Board," she continued, undeterred. "Given the potential scientific value and the unique opportunity to study human emotional displays in an educational context, I anticipate approval within 24 hours. You can't just—" "Additionally, I have prepared a preliminary testing schedule." Her fingers danced through the holographic interface. "We will begin with basic stimuli and progress to more complex emotional triggers. I find your species' attachment to fictional narratives particularly puzzling. Perhaps we should start there." Clint looked around at his thoroughly entertained class, then back at the earnestly scientific Alvarian. Her patterns had settled into the steady rhythm of someone who believed they were being completely reasonable. He thought about arguing, about explaining why turning their teacher-student relationship into a research project was inappropriate. Instead, he laughed. The sound seemed to startle Illyra, her patterns briefly flickering to confusion frequencies. "You find this amusing?" she asked, head tilting. "Fascinating. Please explain the humorous element. And if possible, could you produce tears while doing so?" "Ms. Koren," he said, still chuckling, "I think you and I are going to have a very interesting semester." "Interesting is an imprecise term," she replied. "I prefer to think of it as scientifically significant." As the class bell chimed and students began filing out, Illyra remained at her desk, still taking notes. Clint noticed her patterns had shifted to a new configuration he hadn't seen before. Something between curiosity and something else. "Professor," she called as he gathered his materials, "one more question." "Yes." "These tears, they are not contagious, are they?" He couldn't resist. "Oh, absolutely. Highly infectious. Some humans can't even talk about crying without starting to—" He pretended to choke up. Illyra's patterns flashed alarm red as she backed away. "This requires immediate quarantine protocols." "I'm joking, Ms. Koren. Tears aren't contagious." She froze, then slowly resumed her normal coloring. "Ah, human humor. Another inefficient communication method." But there was something in her tone, just the slightest shift in resonance, that made him wonder if she was more intrigued than annoyed. "See you tomorrow," he said. "Try not to design any invasive experiments before then." "I make no promises, Professor." Was that almost a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth? No, impossible. Alvarians didn't smile. As she left the classroom, her silver hair catching the light like a comet's tail, Clint had the distinct feeling his life was about to become significantly more complicated. And despite his better judgment, he was looking forward to it. The rest of his day passed in a blur of lectures and student meetings, but his mind kept returning to those pupilless white eyes and their intensity. He'd taught plenty of Alvarians before. They made up a significant portion of the Academy's science department, but none quite like Alira. Most simply ignored human emotions as irrelevant data. She wanted to understand them. That evening, as he reviewed his messages, he found the official notice from the Academy Board. Subject: Approval of Cross-Species Emotional Response Study. His new student hadn't been bluffing about the paperwork. The message included a detailed proposal, complete with testing protocols and safety guidelines. At the bottom was a personal note from Alira. Professor Bennett, I appreciate your involuntary contribution to scientific understanding. Please be advised that I have scheduled our first experimental session for tomorrow after class. We will begin with basic stimuli and progress as data warrants. Do not worry, I have researched human pain thresholds extensively. Regards, Alira Koren, Chief Researcher, Acting, Human Emotional Response Study. Clint leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his graying hair. He should be annoyed. He should reject the whole idea. He should maintain professional boundaries. Instead, he found himself typing a reply. Ms. Koren, I look forward to seeing your scientific method in action. Though I should warn you, human emotions rarely follow logical protocols. And please, no more toe injuries. Regards, your reluctant test subject. Her response came seconds later. Noted. Though I must point out that your use of humor in this response supports my hypothesis about emotional deflection mechanisms. This will be documented in tomorrow's baseline assessment. PM. I have reconsidered the toe injury approach. There are more efficient methods of tear extraction. Clint stared at the message for a long moment before laughing out loud. Either this was going to be the most interesting semester of his teaching career, or he was going to end up as a cautionary tale in some Alvarian research paper. Possibly both. The next morning, Clint arrived at his classroom to find it transformed into what resembled a scientific laboratory. Holographic sensors floated at strategic points, and his desk had been outfitted with what appeared to be medical monitoring equipment. Good morning, Professor. Alira's voice came from behind a particularly large scanner. Please take your seat. I've calibrated everything to human biological parameters. Ms. Cohen, this is still a classroom, not a research facility. Incorrect. It is both. She emerged wearing what appeared to be a modified Alvarian science uniform. The sleek silver material highlighted her blue skin in ways that made Clint momentarily forget his objections. I have received permission to conduct experiments during non-teaching hours. Your first class begins in 47 minutes, giving us ample time for baseline readings. And what exactly do these baseline readings involve? She consulted her holographic display. First, we will establish your normal tear production rate through exposure to various stimuli. I've prepared several scenarios. Such as? In response, she pressed a button. Death metal music suddenly blasted through the room's audio system at near painful volumes. Clint clapped his hands over his ears. According to my research, Alira shouted over the cacophony, humans sometimes produce tears in response to musical stimulation. Is this having any effect? Only on my sanity. He reached for the controls, shutting off the noise. What made you choose that particular genre? It appeared to be the most emotionally intense based on decibel levels and lyrical content. She made a note. Though I admit I found the repeated references to ripping out souls somewhat puzzling given the physical impossibility of the action. Clint couldn't help but laugh. Maybe we should start with something simpler. Agreed. Please review this selection of tragic narratives I've compiled. She handed him a tablet. I've arranged them in order of increasing emotional devastation. As he scrolled through the list, his eyebrows rose. Ms. Koren, these are all stories about dogs dying. Yes, my research indicates humans are particularly susceptible to narratives involving deceased canines. Something about their status as companion animals? She leaned closer, scanners whirring. Are you experiencing increased lacrimal activity yet? I'm experiencing increased concern about your research methods. Her patterns shifted to what he was beginning to recognize as frustration. Perhaps we should move on to the philosophical existential crisis portion of the experiment. How about we focus on today's actual lesson instead? He gestured to the students beginning to file in, many of whom were staring at the transformed classroom with obvious curiosity. Very well. Her patterns dimmed slightly. But I expect you to review the complete tragedy compilation before our next session. I've included several particularly affecting stories about elderly pets saying goodbye to their humans. Throughout the day's lessons, Clint caught Alira watching him intently, her scanners quietly collecting data. When he made a joke about ancient human politics, she noted the class's laughter with scientific precision. When he grew passionate about describing humanity's first steps into space, her patterns shifted to colors he hadn't seen before. It was during lunch that things took an unexpected turn. He was just about to bite into his sandwich when Alira appeared, snatching it away with lightning reflexes. Hey, Professor, do you feel emotional attachment to this nutrient preparation? She held the sandwich at arm's length, studying his reaction. Would its destruction cause lacrimal response? It would cause me to give you detention. Fascinating. She returned the sandwich, making more notes. Your species forms emotional bonds with processed food items? No, we form emotional bonds with our lunch breaks. Speaking of which, he gestured to the empty chair across from him. To his surprise, she sat down. Her movements were precise, almost mechanical, but there was something in the way her patterns rippled that suggested uncertainty. I've been meaning to ask, he said, taking advantage of the moment. Why are you really here, Ms. Cohen? And don't give me the official line about studying human irrationality. Her patterns stilled, becoming almost monochromatic, a response he'd never seen before. I experienced an anomaly in my youth. Her voice dropped to a near whisper. I displayed emotional responses during a cultural exchange program. My parents were concerned. What happened? I underwent reconditioning. Her words were clinical, but her patterns betrayed something deeper. Flickers of darker blues, almost black. The Science Institute believes studying humans might help prevent such irregularities from recurring. They sent you here as prevention? They sent me here to understand the enemy. She met his eyes. Emotions are a weakness your species has somehow turned into a cultural cornerstone. It's fascinating, if ultimately self-destructive. Is that what you really believe, or what they taught you to believe? Her patterns flashed warning red. You're attempting to manipulate my responses through targeted questioning. This conversation is terminated. She stood abruptly, nearly knocking over her chair. Alira, Ms. Cohen, she corrected sharply. We will resume experimental protocols tomorrow. Please prepare yourself for scenarios designed to test emotional responses to personal loss. She strode away, her silver hair catching the light like a metallic waterfall. But Clint noticed her patterns hadn't returned to their usual steady rhythm. They remained turbulent, confused. The next few weeks became a bizarre dance of education and experimentation. Alira's attempts to provoke emotional responses grew increasingly elaborate. She arranged for a group of Centaurian students to perform what she called a statistically proven tear-inducing musical composition. It was My Heart Will Go On, played on alien instruments. She programmed the classroom's environmental controls to simulate what she termed meteorological emotional enhancement. It rained inside for an entire lesson. But it was her philosophical ambushes that proved most challenging. Professor, she'd ask in the middle of lectures, given the eventual heat death of the universe, how do you justify emotional attachment to temporary phenomena? Or, if human consciousness is merely an emergent property of neural activity, aren't your tears simply a chemical malfunction? The other students began taking sides. The Nebulans found the whole thing hilarious, their gaseous forms rippling with amusement. The Proxima natives started a betting pool on when Alira would finally succeed in making him cry. Even the typically stoic Centaurians were caught up in the drama. Then came the day everything changed. Clint was discussing the first human-alien marriage when a student asked about his own romantic history. Before he could deflect, he found himself talking about Alice, his co-pilot from the early days of interstellar exploration, how they'd fallen in love among the stars, how she'd chosen to take that deep space mission, promising to return, how the wormhole had collapsed. He didn't realize he was crying until he saw Elira's patterns explode into chaos. She stood so quickly her desk toppled, scanners forgotten. Professor ... Her voice held something new. Concern, fear. I feel... She pressed a hand to her chest, her patterns cycling through colors he'd never seen before. There's a sensation. Here. It's uncomfortable. Like gravity has increased, but only inside. That's empathy, Elira. He used her first name deliberately, watching her patterns respond. You're feeling what I'm feeling. No! She backed away, bumping into other desks. This is unacceptable. This is contamination. I need... Her patterns went completely dark as she fled the classroom. Clint found her later in the observatory, surrounded by the stars she claimed to view with pure scientific detachment. Her patterns were muted, barely visible. Go away, she said without turning. I'm composing my report to the Science Institute, requesting immediate withdrawal from this program. Because you felt something? Because I failed. Her patterns flared briefly before dimming again. I was supposed to study human emotions, not contract them. Emotions aren't a disease, Elira. In my culture, they might as well be. She finally turned to face him, and he was shocked to see her patterns forming shapes he recognized from human art. Swirls and eddies like Van Gogh's Starry Night. Do you know what they did to me when I showed emotional response as a child? They put me in isolation, said they had to purge the weakness before it spread. Clint moved closer, careful not to startle her. And did it work? Until you. The accusation in her voice was undercut by something else. Wonder? Your tears. They're not weakness at all, are they? They're connection. Now you're getting it. Her patterns shifted again, forming complex fractals he'd never seen in any Alvarian. The dean warned me about you. Said you were corrupting me with human sentimentality. But it's more than that, isn't it? You're making me remember who I was before I... She trailed off, her patterns suddenly freezing in place. Clint realized she was staring at him with an intensity that made his breath catch. Professor Bennett, she said formally, though her patterns betrayed her turmoil, I find myself experiencing responses that cannot be quantified by current scientific parameters. Such as, my respiratory rate increases in your presence. My pattern frequencies shift without conscious control. I find myself inventing increasingly elaborate experiments simply to prolong our interactions. She paused, her patterns forming shapes that seemed almost human. I believe I may be compromised beyond recovery. Elira, please don't speak. She held up a hand. I must report these findings to my superiors, though perhaps not immediately. She turned back to the stars, but not before Clint caught a glimpse of something impossible, a single drop of moisture at the corner of her eye. Fascinating, she whispered, touching her face. It appears your tears are indeed contagious after all. The next morning, Clint's classroom felt strangely empty, without Elira's usual array of scientific equipment. She sat rigidly in her seat, patterns muted to an almost uniform gray, pointedly avoiding his gaze. The other students watched the tension with poorly concealed interest. Today, Clint began, we're discussing humanity's darkest hour, the Mars colony disaster of 2089. He noticed Elira's patterns flickering briefly with interest despite her apparent determination to remain detached. Everyone knows the facts, he continued. Life support failure, communication blackout, 300 colonists facing certain death. But what the history books don't always capture is what happened next. He pulled up a holographic image, a group of astronauts boarding rescue ships. These people knew it was probably a one-way trip. The solar storms made conventional navigation impossible. But they went anyway. When asked why, Commander Blake said something that changed how aliens viewed humanity forever. He paused, watching Elira's patterns begin to shift. She said, because they're crying out there. Elira's patterns suddenly blazed with color. Illogical, she interrupted, her voice strained. The vacuum of space prevents sound transmission. They couldn't possibly hear. It was metaphorical, Ms. Koren. She meant she could feel their pain, their fear, their hope. And because she could feel it, she had to act. Emotional decision-making. Illyra's patterns were becoming increasingly erratic. It should have resulted in additional casualties. The mathematical probabilities were terrible, Clint agreed. And yet, they saved every single colonist because they refused to accept the logical conclusion, because they let their hearts overrule their heads. Hearts are merely circulatory organs, Illyra protested, but her patterns were forming increasingly complex emotional signatures. They cannot overrule, cannot. A single tear rolled down her blue cheek. The classroom fell silent. Illyra touched the moisture with trembling fingers, her patterns exploding into a kaleidoscope of colors never before seen in an Alvarian. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." She bolted from the room, leaving a trail of chaotic light patterns in her wake. The other students burst into excited chatter, but Clint was already moving. He found her in the observatory again, but this time she wasn't admiring the stars. She was frantically sending messages on her communication device. "I've requested emergency extraction," she announced without turning. "The Science Institute will send a ship. They'll fix this. Malfunction." "It's not a malfunction, Illyra." "Of course it is." She spun to face him, her patterns strobing with distress. "Look at me. I'm leaking, like some primitive organism without proper fluid control." "Then let's analyze it scientifically," Clint suggested, deliberately using her preferred approach. "What evidence do you have that emotions are actually a weakness?" This caught her off guard. Her patterns settled into something resembling their usual analytical configuration, though with new undertones of color he'd never seen before. "The data is clear," she began, but with less certainty than usual. "Emotional species show decreased efficiency in..." "Really? Then explain how humanity went from a pre-spaceflight civilization to a galactic power in less than 2 centuries. Through technological advancement and..." "Through passion," he corrected. "Through dreams and hopes, and yes, through tears. Every major breakthrough in human history came because someone cared enough to push past the logical limitations." Her patterns wavered. "But my people..." "Your people achieved incredible things through logic, yes. But what if you could have both? What if emotion and reason aren't enemies but partners?" "That's..." She paused, her scientist's mind engaging despite her fear. "An intriguing hypothesis." "Then test it." He stepped closer. "You're already the most brilliant student I've ever taught. Imagine what you could do if you allowed yourself to feel the wonder in the equations you love so much." Her patterns shifted to something new, a blend of analytical precision and emotional resonance that seemed to illuminate her from within. "The Science Institute would never accept..." "The Science Institute isn't here. It's just you, making your own observations and drawing your own conclusions." She was quiet for a long moment, her patterns cycling through every color he'd ever seen her display, and some he hadn't. Finally, she spoke. "I have a confession, Professor Bennett." Her voice carried a new note, something almost like humor. "My research has been compromised." "Oh, yes, I find myself experiencing..." She consulted her ever-present data display. "What humans call fondness for my test subject. This clearly invalidates any pretense of scientific objectivity." Clint felt his heart skip. "That is a serious breach of protocol." "Indeed." Her patterns formed shapes he'd never seen in any Alvarian, curves and swirls that reminded him of Earth's aurora borealis. "I should immediately terminate the experiment and return home for reconditioning. Or, she took a deep breath, "I could expand the parameters of the study. Perhaps emotions deserve more thorough investigation than my people have previously allowed." Before Clint could respond, his communication device chimed. It was the dean. "Professor Bennett." The holographic figure looked grave. "The Alvarian Science Institute has demanded Ms. Cohen's immediate return. They're citing concerning changes in her behavior and blaming your unorthodox teaching methods." Clint glanced at Illyra, who stood straighter, her patterns stabilizing into something new, neither purely logical nor purely emotional, but a harmonious blend of both. "Dean," she said clearly, "please inform the Institute that I decline their request. Ms. Cohen, your people's educational treaty with Earth requires that students be allowed to pursue their chosen fields of study," she interrupted. "I choose to study the integration of emotion and logic in educational methodology, with Professor Bennett as my advisor, if he's willing." She turned to Clint, her patterns forming question marks he strongly suspected she'd learned from human punctuation. "Are you willing, Professor?" He grinned. "I think you already know the answer to that." Ms. Cohen. "Illyra," she corrected, and there was definitely humor in her voice now. "I believe we're past formal titles, given that you've successfully infected me with your human emotional responses." The dean sputtered about protocols and treaties, but Clint barely heard him. He was too fascinated by the way Illyra's patterns had begun forming tiny heart shapes, probably unconsciously, among their usual mathematical sequences. "You realize this won't be easy," he warned. "The Institute won't give up without a fight." "Good." Her smile, the first real one he'd ever seen from her, was radiant. "I've developed quite an appreciation for human-style determination, and—" she touched her cheek where the tear had fallen. "I find myself curious about other emotional experiences I may have missed. Such as joy, wonder, perhaps even—" her patterns flickered playfully. "What humans call romance, though purely for academic purposes, of course." "Of course," Clint agreed, fighting to keep his face serious. "We'll need to design proper experimental protocols. Naturally, I suggest we begin with a traditional human courtship ritual, perhaps over what you call coffee." "Ms. Illyra, are you asking me on a date?" "I'm proposing a longitudinal study of human pair bonding behaviors," she corrected primly, but her patterns were dancing with light. "With myself as the primary investigator and you as the test subject." "And what about your previous experiments? The tear collection?" She waved dismissively. "Old data. I have a new hypothesis about human emotions." Her patterns formed a complex equation that somehow managed to look like a winking face. "I suspect they might be contagious in the best possible way." "Well," Clint said, trying to maintain his professional demeanor, despite the smile tugging at his lips, "if this is going to be a proper scientific study, we should establish a parameters." "Already done." Illyra pulled up her holographic display, now showing what appeared to be a detailed relationship flowchart. "I've analyzed successful human courtship patterns and created an optimal progression schedule." "You've what?" "For instance," she continued, scrolling through her data, "traditional first dates have an 87% higher success rate when involving shared consumption of beverages, hence my coffee proposal. Though I must note that my research indicates physical contact often begins with—" she paused, her patterns shifting to a shy purple. "Hand-holding." "I see you've been thorough in your research." "Naturally," her patterns swirled playfully, "though I find myself experiencing some anxiety about the practical application." Clint stepped closer, holding out his hand. "Want to test your hypothesis?" She stared at his offered hand, her patterns flickering rapidly. "This is highly irregular. I haven't even established proper control groups." "Sometimes," he said softly, "the best discoveries happen outside the laboratory." Slowly, almost reverently, she placed her hand in his. Her skin was cool and smooth, and where they touched, her bioluminescent patterns seemed to pulse in sync with his heartbeat. "Oh," she breathed, "the data was insufficient to prepare me for this." "How so?" "The physiological response is far more intense than documented. My cardiac rhythm has increased by 23%. My peripheral nervous system is generating unprecedented signals. And my patterns?" She glanced down at where their hands joined, where her usual mathematical sequences had transformed into something that looked remarkably like hearts and stars. "This is extremely unscientific. And how do you feel about that?" Her free hand touched her cheek, where that first tear had fallen. "I find myself not caring about the scientific implications. Is this normal?" "Perfectly normal." He squeezed her hand gently. Though I should warn you, emotional responses tend to intensify with prolonged exposure. Really? Her patterns brightened with interest. Perhaps we should accelerate the testing schedule. For academic purposes, of course. Of course, he grinned. Though I feel obligated to inform you that human courtship often involves another form of physical contact. Her patterns formed a question mark. You mean kite? The Academy's warning system chose that moment to blare to life, making them both jump. Attention all faculty and students, the dean's voice echoed through the observatory. A delegation from the Alvarian Science Institute has just entered orbit. They are demanding immediate contact with Ms. Koren. Illyra's patterns dimmed, but she didn't let go of Clint's hand. If anything, she held on tighter. Well, she said, trying to sound clinical despite her trembling voice, it appears we'll have to postpone our experiment. Or, Clint suggested, we could give them a practical demonstration of why emotional intelligence deserves serious study. Her patterns shifted to what he now recognized as her determined configuration, a mix of logical precision and emotional fire that made her practically glow. Professor Bennett, she said formally, though her hand was still warm in his, would you be willing to assist me in a rather unconventional presentation to the Institute? What did you have in mind? Her patterns formed that impossible winking equation again. I believe humans have a saying about actions speaking louder than words. Before he could respond, she rose up on her toes and pressed her lips to his. Her patterns exploded into a symphony of color that lit up the entire observatory. When she pulled back, they were both a little breathless. Fascinating, she murmured. I believe I've just discovered why humans consider kissing a superior form of communication to logical discourse. And what conclusion have you drawn from this experiment? That I need much more data. Her patterns sparkled mischievously. Shall we show the Institute your teaching methods in action? The Alvarian delegation arrived in a flurry of stern faces and disapproving patterns. 5 senior scientists, their formal robes glowing with complex mathematical theorems, materialized in the observatory's central platform. Researcher Koren, the lead scientist intoned, his patterns rigid with authority. You have deviated from approved protocols. Your emotional contamination must be addressed immediately. Illyra stepped forward, still holding Clint's hand. Her patterns, rather than dimming under their scrutiny, blazed brighter. Honored teachers, she began, her voice clear and strong, I wish to present my preliminary findings on human emotional intelligence. There will be no presentation. You will return to Alvar for immediate reconditioning. According to Section 47.3 of the Institute's charter, she countered, any researcher may present significant discoveries to the board. Are you denying me this right? The scientists exchanged glances, their patterns showing brief confusion. Finally, the leader nodded stiffly. Proceed, but be brief. Illyra's patterns formed a complex series of equations that Clint recognized from their earlier conversations about emotion and logic. Honored teachers, we have made a fundamental error in our understanding of emotional responses. They are not weakness. They are a form of advanced processing that enhances rather than diminishes analytical capability. Impossible, one scientist scoffed. Emotions cloud judgment. Do they? Illyra turned to Clint. Professor Bennett, please explain to the delegation how humanity achieved faster-than-light travel. Clint stepped forward. We were told it was impossible. The equations didn't work, but we wanted to reach the stars so badly that we kept trying, kept pushing, kept dreaming. And because we cared enough to defy logic, we found a way. Anecdotal evidence, another scientist dismissed. One success does not. The Mars rescue, Illyra interrupted. The first contact protocols, the Nebula War Peace Treaty, every major advancement in human history came not just from logical processing, but from emotional investment. Her patterns formed a complex proof. I can demonstrate. Before anyone could stop her, she turned to Clint and kissed him again. Her patterns exploded into colors that made the senior scientist gasp. When she pulled back, she was smiling, actually smiling, at their shocked expressions. Scan me, she challenged. My neural activity, my processing speed, my analytical capabilities, they haven't decreased. If anything, they've expanded. I'm not just thinking anymore. I'm feeling, understanding, connecting on levels our pure logic never reached. The scientists huddled together, their patterns showing intense discussion. Finally, the leader turned back. "This is unprecedented," he admitted. "You appear to have maintained cognitive function despite clear emotional activation." "I haven't maintained it," Illyra corrected. "I've enhanced it, and I can prove it." She pulled up her research data, years of observations, experiments, and analysis. "This isn't contamination, it's evolution." The scientists spent the next hour reviewing her data, their patterns showing increasing agitation, and, though they probably didn't realize it, increasing interest. "This requires further study," the leader finally declared. "I agree." Illyra's patterns formed a complex proposal. "I request permission to establish a joint human-Alvarian research program on emotional intelligence integration, with Professor Bennett as co-chair, of course." The scientists conferred again, their patterns gradually shifting from rigid mathematics to more organic forms. "Granted," the leader said eventually, "but with conditions. You will submit regular reports, you will maintain rigorous documentation, and you will—" He paused, patterns showing something almost like curiosity. "Explain this kissing phenomenon in greater detail." After the delegation departed, Clint turned to Illyra. "Did you plan this?" "Of course." Her patterns danced with satisfaction, though the kissing was a somewhat impulsive addition to the experimental protocol. "And what are your conclusions about that particular experiment?" "Insufficient data," she replied, her patterns forming that now familiar winking equation. "I believe we need to run multiple trials under varying conditions." "For science." "For science," as she agreed, pulling him closer. "Though I find myself increasingly interested in the non-scientific applications as well." Their laughter echoed through the observatory, their shadows merging as her patterns painted the stars with new colors. Colors that spoke of logic and emotion, reason and passion, science and love, all dancing together in perfect harmony. Over the next few months, the Academy witnessed the strangest courtship in its history. Illyra approached romance with the same meticulous attention to detail she brought to everything else. She created spreadsheets rating different types of kisses on a complex matrix of variables. The data clearly shows that spontaneous displays of affection generate 27% more positive response than planned encounters. She documented their dates with scientific precision, complete with atmospheric conditions and psychological impact assessments. The rainfall during our walk actually enhanced the romantic atmosphere by 43%, despite the obvious impracticality. She even started a research journal titled A Comprehensive Study of Human-Alvarian Pair Bonding Behaviors, which somehow became required reading at the Science Institute. But sometimes when she thought no one was watching, she would just hold Clint's hand and let her patterns form simple hearts. No equations required. For his part, Clint found himself falling more deeply in love with every new discovery she made. Her joy at experiencing emotions for the first time was contagious. She approached everything, from ice cream to sunset walks, with a wonderful blend of scientific curiosity and childlike wonder. "The chemical composition of chocolate is fascinating," she would declare, "but the way it makes me feel—" Her patterns would shift to warm, happy colors. That defies analytical parameters. Their relationship became something of a legend at the Academy. Students would whisper about how the cold, logical Alvarian learned to cry, laugh, and love. Some said they saw her dancing in the rain, her patterns matching the rhythm of the falling drops. Others swore they heard her singing in the observatory late at night, her voice carrying ancient Earth love songs to the stars. The Science Institute's regular inspections became less about monitoring for contamination and more about studying their success. More Alvarian students began showing interest in emotional intelligence studies. Some even requested human teachers specifically. And if anyone noticed that the most brilliant mathematical mind of her generation sometimes doodled hearts in the margins of her research papers, well, they kept it to themselves. After all, as Illyra liked to say, the most fascinating discoveries often came from unexpected combinations. One particular incident stood out in the Academy's collective memory: the day Alira decided to quantify love. She had set up an elaborate array of sensors in their favorite spot in the observatory, determined to measure every physiological response when Clint said, "I love you." "Hold still," she instructed, attaching monitors to his temples. "I need accurate baseline readings." "Is all this really necessary?" he asked, trying not to laugh as she circled him with scanning equipment. "Of course. Love is the most complex human emotion. It requires thorough documentation. Her patterns form complex mathematical sequences. Now please express your romantic attachment while I measure your neural activity." Clint gently removed the sensors. "That's not how this works. But the data, some things can't be measured, Illyra." Her patterns dimmed. "Everything can be measured. It's just a matter of finding the right parameters." "Okay," he said, taking her hands in his. "Then measure this." He pulled her close and kissed her. Not the careful, documented kisses of her experiments, but a real kiss that made her patterns explode into colors she'd never displayed before. When they finally parted, she blinked at him dazedly. "My equipment didn't record any of that." "Exactly." She stared at her blank data screens, then back at him. "But how will I know it's real if I can't measure it? How do you feel right now?" I... Her patterns shifted through a rainbow of emotions. "My cognitive functions are compromised. My respiratory rate is elevated. My pattern control is completely destabilized, and She touched her chest. "I feel like I'm containing a supernova." "That's love." "Oh." Her patterns formed a perfect heart, then quickly reverted to equations. "But surely we should still gather some basic data." He kissed her again, and this time she let her scanners lie forgotten as her patterns painted the observatory walls with dancing lights. Their first fight came during finals week, when Alira's determination to document everything clashed with Clint's more spontaneous nature. "You can't schedule emotional intimacy in 15-minute increments," he exclaimed, looking at the detailed timetable she'd created. "Why not?" "It's efficient." Her patterns showed genuine confusion. "I've allocated time for both structured and unstructured romantic interactions, with appropriate buffer periods for emotional processing." "That's not romance, that's accounting." "What's wrong with accounting?" Her patterns flared defensively. "The universe runs on numbers, Clint. Even emotions have mathematical components. But they're not just numbers. You can't reduce everything to data points." "Of course I can. That's how I understand things." Her patterns were strobing now, showing real distress. "How else am I supposed to make sense of these feelings? They're chaotic and illogical, and sometimes they hurt, and I don't know how to—" She stopped, touching her cheek where tears were starting to fall. Clint's anger melted. "Hey," he said softly, pulling her into his arms. "I'm sorry. I know this is all new for you." "I just want to do it right," she whispered against his chest. "I've never felt like this before. It's wonderful and terrifying, and I don't know the proper protocols." "There are no proper protocols for love." She looked up at him, her patterns forming a mixture of hearts and question marks. "Then how do you know what to do?" "You don't. You just feel it. That's highly inefficient." "Yes," he laughed, kissing her forehead. "Yes, it is." After that, she still made her schedules and charts, but she left room for what she called unquantifiable variables, which basically meant letting Clint surprise her sometimes. The Academy's annual science fair became another memorable chapter in their story. Illyra, to everyone's shock, entered the creative expression category instead of pure mathematics. Her project was called The Geometry of Love, a massive holographic display that translated emotional responses into mathematical patterns. When viewers stepped into the display, their feelings created complex, beautiful equations that danced around them like aurora borealis. "It's both scientifically accurate and aesthetically pleasing," she explained proudly. "The patterns are based on actual neurological responses, but arranged to create what humans call art." The judges were skeptical at first, but when they saw how the patterns changed based on genuine emotions, how joy created spiraling fractals, how love formed heart-shaped quantum equations, they were amazed. Illyra won first prize, though she seemed more pleased by Clint's reaction to the private showing she gave him later, where the patterns formed their entire love story in mathematical poetry. The turning point in their relationship came during the Interstellar Educational Conference, where Elira was invited to present her research on emotional intelligence integration. The greatest minds from across the galaxy gathered to hear how an Alvarian scientist had revolutionized their understanding of emotion and logic. Clint sat in the front row, watching proudly as Elira took the stage. Her patterns were steady and confident, forming complex equations that somehow managed to look like works of art. "Distinguished colleagues," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the vast auditorium. "For centuries, we Alvarians believed that logic and emotion were incompatible. We were wrong." She activated a holographic display showing brain scans, her own, from before and after her emotional awakening. As you can see, emotional engagement doesn't diminish cognitive function, it enhances it. When we allow ourselves to feel, we don't just process information, we understand it. We don't just observe the universe, we connect with it. To demonstrate, she did something unprecedented. She invited the entire audience to participate in a mass emotional intelligence experiment. The hall's holographic systems transformed into a vast version of her award-winning Geometry of Love project. "Don't analyze," and she instructed the skeptical scientists. "Just feel." As the audience cautiously opened themselves to the experience, the hall filled with spectacular light patterns, equations born from emotions, theorems shaped by feelings. It was like watching the birth of a new kind of science. Then Elira turned to Clint, her patterns forming the most beautiful equation he'd ever seen, one that somehow spelled out, "Will you marry me?" in mathematical symbols. The audience gasped. Even among humans, public proposals were bold. For an Alvarian to do it, to choose love over protocol, it was revolutionary. "I've analyzed all possible variables," she said, her patterns trembling slightly. "And while I cannot predict the outcome with 100% certainty, which is most unsettling, I find myself willing to embrace the statistical uncertainty, because you taught me that some risks are worth taking." Clint walked onto the stage, taking her hands in his. "Are you sure the Institute can review my data?" she interrupted. "I've documented everything extensively. The benefits of our pair bonding far outweigh any potential cultural complications." He laughed. "That's the most romantic thing you've ever said." Their wedding became a symbol of the new era in human-Alvarian relations. They combined both cultures' traditions, logical Alvarian binding ceremonies alongside emotional human vows. Elira's patterns formed hearts and equations simultaneously as they kissed. The Science Institute, rather than objecting, declared it a fascinating cultural experiment and sent observers to document everything. Though Clint suspected they were more moved by the ceremony than they let on, several of them displayed distinctly heart-shaped patterns during the vows. After the wedding, Elira was offered a position as head researcher at the Institute's new Emotional Intelligence Department. It meant returning to Alvar, but with a mission: to teach young Alvarians that they didn't have to choose between logic and emotion. "Come with me," she asked Clint one night in their observatory. "They need teachers who understand both sides." "Are you sure they're ready for more emotional humans?" Her patterns sparkled with mischief. "They're not. That's precisely why it's necessary." The decision to split their time between Earth and Alvar wasn't easy, but as Elira pointed out, their relationship had never followed normal protocols anyway. They would spend part of the year at the Academy and part on Alvar, building bridges between their cultures. And now, 5 years later, watching Elira teach young Alvarians about the beauty of tears, Clint knew they had made the right choice. She had transformed from the cold, logical student who once thought emotions were a weakness into a woman who could cry freely and still calculate quantum equations in her head. His reply to her message was interrupted by another incoming transmission. This one showed Elira surrounded by excited Alvarian students, their patterns forming wobbly attempts at heart shapes. "Hurry home," she said, her own patterns dancing with joy. "We're making excellent progress. Yesterday, one of my students laughed at a joke. A real laugh, not just an acknowledgement of humorous intent, and I have so many new experiments to show you." Clint finished his message. "My brilliant chief researcher, I can't wait to see what new discoveries you've made. Though I should warn you, after 5 years, you still make my heart defy all logical protocols." forever your favorite test subject. Their story had become legend at the Academy, the cold Alvarian scientist who learned to cry, and the human teacher who proved that love was the most logical force in the universe. But for Clint and Alira, it was just the beginning. After all, they had a whole galaxy of emotions left to explore. One tear, one laugh, one kiss at a time. A message to my dear listeners. In this tale of tears and starlight, we've witnessed something extraordinary, not just a love story, but a bridge between two worlds that seem forever apart. Elira and Clint's journey reminds us that the greatest discoveries often happen when we dare to cross the boundaries we've built around our hearts. Perhaps you felt like Elira once did, afraid to show emotion, believing that feelings make you weak. Or maybe you're more like Clint, struggling to connect with someone who sees the world through a completely different lens. Their story teaches us that these differences aren't barriers, they're opportunities for growth. The universe is vast and often seems cold, full of mathematical certainties and logical absolutes. But between the equations and star charts, there's room for wonder. There's space for tears that come from joy, laughter that defies explanation, and love that transcends cultural boundaries. Remember that like Elira's bioluminescent patterns, we all have our own way of showing who we are. Some of us speak in numbers, others in poetry. Some calculate, others feel. But the most beautiful discoveries happen when we learn to do both, when we let our hearts and minds dance together like equations made of starlight. Don't be afraid to cry. Don't hesitate to laugh. And most importantly, never stop reaching across the void to connect with those who seem different from you. Because sometimes the most logical thing we can do is let ourselves feel, and the most emotional thing we can do is understand. After all, as a certain Alvarian scientist and her human teacher proved, tears can be contagious in the best possible way. So go forth, dear readers. Find your own equations of the heart. Create your own geometry of love. And remember that somewhere out there, among the endless stars, an Alvarian is teaching her students that it's okay to cry while calculating the distance between galaxies. Because in the end, we're all made of the same stardust. Logical and emotional, rational and passionate, each of us containing universes of possibility just waiting to be explored. And that, perhaps, is the most beautiful equation of all.